Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing stories ever to echo through the Appalachian Mountains. Comment where you're watching from now. It was the year 1908, and the dense forests of West Virginia held secrets that no map could reveal. Among deep valleys and forgotten trails, there existed an isolated community where time seemed to run slower. There, among wooden cabins and oil lamps, lived Eliza Warren, a solitary woman known for her knowledge of medicinal herbs and ancestral rituals that few dared question. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Eliza lived on a secluded property, surrounded by giant fir trees that blocked the sunlight even at midday. The nearest neighbors were miles away, and few ventured down the winding path that led to her door. There was something in the atmosphere of that place that made horses recoil and dogs howl for no apparent reason. The locals avoided speaking about her openly, but in nightly whispers, stories circulated through the local taverns. They said Eliza had arrived in that region from some undefined place, bringing with her only a worn leather suitcase and a gaze that seemed to pierce through people. No one knew for sure where she had come from, and she never offered any explanations. She settled on that abandoned property as if she had always belonged to that gloomy place. Over time, she began to receive sporadic visits from desperate people seeking cures for ailments that conventional medicine could not treat. The house where Eliza lived was peculiar, built decades earlier by a hermit who had died under circumstances never clarified. The dark wooden structure seemed to absorb the little light that managed to penetrate between the trees. Narrow windows with frosted glass prevented anyone outside from seeing inside. An irregular fence of grey stones marked the boundary of the property, and on its main gate hung a rusty chain that creaked in the wind like a continuous lament. The residents of the nearest village, Webster Springs, maintained an ambiguous relationship with Eliza. Some sought her out in moments of desperation, when mysterious fevers plagued their homes or when inexplicable pains persisted for weeks. She always received them, prepared her mixtures of plants harvested under the full moon, and charged modest fees for her services. Many swore that her potions worked better than any medicine bought in the town's pharmacies. Others, however, returned disturbed, speaking of strange symbols drawn on the interior walls of the house and of sounds they couldn't identify coming from the basement. The winter of 1908 was particularly harsh in that region of the Appalachians. The snow covered the paths in considerable thickness, further isolating those who lived in the mountainous areas. For weeks, Eliza was not seen by anyone. Her chimney, which usually emitted smoke even on the coldest days, remained unlit. Some thought she had left, abandoning that inhospitable place in search of less harsh lands. Others imagined the worst, fearing that loneliness and the cold had overcome her. When spring finally began to melt the layers of ice, a traveling merchant passing through the area noticed that the door to Eliza's house was ajar, swaying slightly in the wind. He cautiously approached, calling her name, but only the echo of his own voice answered. Pushing open the door, he was confronted with a scene that would haunt his nightmares for years. The house was intact on the outside, but the interior revealed signs of sudden abandonment. Objects were scattered, furniture overturned, and a heavy silence seemed to carry something indefinable. In the following days, curious onlookers and local authorities searched every room of that gloomy residence. They found bottles containing liquids of impossible colors, handwritten books in languages no one recognized, and intricate drawings etched into the wooden floor. In the basement, they discovered something that would completely change their perception of Eliza Warren. There were structures there that suggested experiments of unknown nature, archaic instruments whose purpose no one could determine, and detailed records in notebooks documenting practices that defied any rational explanation. Webster County Sheriff Thomas Blackwell, a pragmatic man, took over the investigation. He repeatedly walked the property, questioned everyone who had had contact with Eliza, and tried to reconstruct her last movements. But the more he investigated, the more unanswered questions arose. There was no sign of a struggle, no indication of a planned departure, and no evidence to explain where Eliza might have gone or what had really happened in that house during the winter months. The records found in Eliza's house revealed a complex and unsettling mind. Page after page, filled with meticulous handwriting, described rituals involving lunar cycles, stellar alignments, and practices that blended ancestral knowledge with rudimentary scientific observations. Blackwell spent entire nights trying to decipher those writings, but the language used alternated between archaic English and symbols that seemed to belong to some unknown notation system. Among Eliza's belongings was an impressive collection of botanical specimens, dried plants, roots preserved in glass jars, seeds arranged in small linen bags. Some were easily recognizable as medicinal herbs common in that region of the Appalachians. Others, however, defied identification. Blackwell consulted a botany professor from the University of Virginia who occasionally visited Webster Springs, but even he admitted never having seen some of those species. Their characteristics were too peculiar, their colors too intense. Their forms deviated from expected natural patterns. The basement of the house was the space that most intrigued the researchers. Unlike the rest of the building, this environment had been carefully prepared. The walls were lined with more resistant boards, the floor was precisely leveled, and there was a rudimentary ventilation system that allowed air circulation even with the door closed. In the center of the room, circular marks engraved in the wood formed geometric patterns that repeated themselves in decreasing dimensions, like waves propagating from a central point. Around these marks, they found candles consumed to their last fragments of wax, forming perfect circles. The smell of incense still permeated the air months later, a heavy fragrance that mixed woody notes with something slightly sweet and indefinable. On the shelves that occupied the side walls, labeled bottles contained substances ranging from gray powders to viscous amber-colored liquids. Each label bore names written in that same intricate handwriting, but the words did not correspond to any known vocabulary. Thomas Blackwell decided to methodically question everyone who had visited Eliza in the months leading up to the winter of 1908. The first was Martha Hensley, a woman who ran a boarding house in Webster Springs. Martha admitted to visiting Eliza in October of that year, seeking help for joint pain that had plagued her for months. She described the experience with a mixture of gratitude and unease. According to Martha, Eliza greeted her with distant cordiality, leading her to a back room where she conducted her consultations. There, under the light of strategically placed lamps, Eliza examined her hands for long minutes, touching specific points and murmuring words that Martha couldn't understand. Then she prepared an infusion using herbs gathered from her garden, instructing Martha to drink it for 7 consecutive nights, always before sunset. Martha followed the instructions to the letter, and surprisingly, the pain had significantly decreased. But there was something else Martha hesitated to reveal. When pressed by Blackwell, she finally admitted to hearing sounds coming from the basement during her visit. They weren't exactly voices, but something resembling rhythmic vibrations, as if some kind of machinery were operating deep within the house. When she had questioned Eliza about it, she had received only an enigmatic smile and the suggestion that some secrets were better kept unexplained. Another frequent visitor was Daniel Cooper, a blacksmith who lived on the outskirts of Webster Springs. Daniel had sought out Eliza several times over the years, always looking for treatments for various ailments. He described Eliza as a woman of few words but keen observation. She had a habit of studying people in silence before making any diagnosis, as if she could see beyond superficial complaints and identify deeper imbalances. On his last visit, at the end of November, Daniel had noticed a change in Eliza's behavior. She seemed more distant, absorbed in thoughts that disconnected her from the present. When he mentioned the approaching harsh winter and suggested she consider spending those months in the village, where she would have more comfort and company, Eliza simply shook her head. She said something about a job that needed to be completed, a journey that demanded solitude and specific conditions that only that isolated place could offer. Weeks passed, and Blackwell accumulated testimonies that, instead of clarifying, only deepened the mystery. Everyone who had known Eliza agreed on one point: she possessed knowledge that transcended common sense. Her potions worked when other treatments failed. Her predictions about climate change were unsettlingly accurate. She knew when someone was lying just by observing their gestures, and she had the ability to make suspicious people trust her instinctively. Blackwell began to realize that he wasn't dealing with just a case of unexplained absence. There were deeper layers to that story, connections that extended beyond that house in the mountains. Eliza Warren wasn't simply a reclusive healer. She was part of something bigger, something that left subtle but disturbing traces throughout that Appalachian region. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Blackwell discovered that Eliza maintained regular correspondence with people from different regions. In the attic of the house, Inside a carefully guarded wooden box, he found dozens of letters dated from the last 3 years. The missives came from places as far away as Massachusetts, Louisiana, and even the West Coast, from a small community in Oregon. They all shared an intriguing pattern. They were written in a respectful, almost reverent tone, and treated Eliza as someone of great importance. One of the letters, dated March 1907, came from a woman named Adelaide who lived in Salem, Massachusetts. She thanked Eliza for sharing knowledge about the properties of certain plants found only in specific swamps during certain lunar phases. Adelaide mentioned having obtained extraordinary results by following the instructions received, and asked permission to pass that information on to other trusted people in her region. The language used suggested the existence of a discrete network of individuals who shared similar interests. Another particularly intriguing letter came from a man identified only as Solomon, a resident of New Orleans, Louisiana. Written in November 1907, the letter discussed a planned meeting for the winter solstice of the following year. Solomon mentioned that other members of the fraternity would also be present, and that it would be a unique opportunity to discuss recent advancements in their practices. He emphasized the importance of discretion and suggested that each participant travel separately, avoiding drawing attention. Blackwell realized that Eliza was part of a circle of people dedicated to studies that blended herbal knowledge with astronomical observations and ritualistic practices. It wasn't necessarily sinister, but certainly unusual, and kept away from the eyes of conventional society. These people communicated through subtle codes, veiled references, and a language of their own that made it difficult for those outside the group to understand. Among the documents was also Eliza's personal diary. The earliest entries dated from 1905, when she apparently arrived in that region of West Virginia. The initial entries were simple, describing her adaptation to the mountainous terrain, the difficulties in cultivating her medicinal herb garden, and her first interactions with the local residents. But as the months progressed, the tone of the entries changed drastically. In June 1906, Eliza wrote about finding something in the surrounding forests during one of her collecting expeditions. She didn't specify exactly what it was, but described the discovery as transformative. She mentioned hidden clearings where vegetation grew in unusual patterns, forming perfect spirals that couldn't be the work of chance. She spoke of water sources with peculiar properties, capable of preserving certain organic materials in an unusual way, and she recorded hearing sounds on full moon nights that didn't correspond to any known animal in the region. The following entries documented experiments that Eliza conducted in her basement. She tested combinations of plant substances, observed natural chemical reactions, and meticulously recorded each result. There were detailed drawings showing how different compounds altered their properties when exposed to specific temperatures or direct moonlight. Eliza demonstrated a self-taught scientific methodology, likely learned through her correspondence with other members of that mysterious network. In December 1907, a little over a year before her departure, Eliza wrote a particularly enigmatic entry. She mentioned being close to completing a work she had begun decades earlier, in another place and under different circumstances. She spoke of cycles closing and portals opening only at specific times, when astrological and geographical conditions aligned perfectly. Her writing revealed a mixture of anxiety and determination, as if she were preparing for something of great magnitude. Blackwell shared his findings with the local judge, a man named Edmund Hartley, known for his open mind and intellectual curiosity. Hartley examined the documents carefully, taking notes and raising questions that Blackwell himself had not considered. Together, they began to draw connections between the letters, the diary entries, and the objects found in the house. A complex picture emerged, suggesting that Eliza was involved in something far more elaborate than simple alternative healing practices. The community of Webster Springs was divided in its opinions about Eliza. Some defended her, arguing that she had never harmed anyone and that her practices, though unconventional, had helped many people. Others expressed distrust, recalling whispered stories about nightly rituals and mysterious visitors who occasionally appeared on her property in the early hours of the morning. Some believed that Eliza had simply decided to leave, seeking new places to continue her studies, and there were those who feared that something terrible had happened in that house during the months of winter isolation. Winter was beginning to give way to spring, and Blackwell knew he needed to intensify his search. He organized groups of volunteers to scour the forests surrounding Eliza's property, looking for any sign that might indicate her whereabouts. They explored forgotten trails, natural caves in the rocky slopes, and even abandoned structures that dotted that mountainous region. But all they found was the dense silence of the ancient trees and the wind whistling through the valleys like a perpetual lament. While the physical searches continued without results, Blackwell kept studying the documents left by Eliza. Each letter, each diary entry, each note in the margins of the books she owned revealed fragments of a larger story. He began to understand that Eliza Warren was not just an isolated figure in the Appalachian Mountains. She was a node in a web that stretched across the country, connecting people who shared knowledge passed down through generations, preserved away from the spotlight of modern society. The spring of 1909 brought unexpected changes to the investigation. A visitor arrived in Webster Springs from Massachusetts, identifying himself as Jonathan Pierce, an academic who corresponded with Eliza. He appeared meticulous, sober clothes, metal-rimmed glasses, and a posture that conveyed knowledge accumulated over years of study. He sought out Blackwell immediately, demonstrating genuine concern about Eliza's prolonged silence. Jonathan explained that he was part of the same circle of scholars mentioned in the letters that were found. They were not a formal organization, but rather individuals united by common interests in ancestral practices, observation of natural phenomena, and preservation of knowledge that modern society tended to dismiss as superstition. Eliza, according to him, was one of the most dedicated among them, someone whose understanding of certain disciplines surpassed that of many who had dedicated themselves to the same studies for decades. Blackwell led Jonathan to the mountain house. The visitor walked through each room with reverent attention, touching objects as one recognizes old friends. In the basement, he remained silent for long minutes, observing the patterns etched into the floor and the shelves filled with jars. Finally, he turned to Blackwell with an expression of concern mixed with something that could be interpreted as admiration or awe. Jonathan revealed that Eliza was working on an ambitious project involving the convergence of natural cycles. She believed she had identified a specific moment when telluric energies aligned with celestial positions, creating unique conditions that occurred only once every several decades. This alignment, according to her theories, would allow for experiments that would be impossible under normal circumstances. The winter of 1908 marked precisely one of these rare moments. Blackwell questioned Jonathan about the exact nature of these experiments. The visitor hesitated, choosing his words carefully. He explained that the group to which they belonged sought to understand connections between different planes of existence, exploring boundaries between the tangible and the intangible. It wasn't magic in the fantastical sense, but observing and potentially interacting with aspects of reality that conventional science had not yet developed instruments to measure or understand. In the following weeks, Jonathan remained in Webster Springs, assisting Blackwell in deciphering Eliza's records. Together, they managed to translate some of the codes she used in her notes. They discovered that many of the plants she cultivated were rare species, some considered extinct in other regions, preserved through cultivation techniques she had learned from previous mentors. These plants possessed unique chemical properties that, when properly combined, produced surprising effects on human consciousness. Jonathan shared stories about other members of the circle, people who, in different times and places, had dedicated their lives to similar studies. There was a man in Tennessee who could predict climate change with impressive accuracy by observing patterns in rock formations. A woman in Vermont maintained a garden where plants from different continents coexisted harmoniously, defying all botanical expectations. An elder in Arizona mastered desert navigation techniques based on astronomical knowledge passed down by native peoples for centuries. According to Jonathan, these people did not seek fame or recognition. They lived discreetly, preserving traditions and exploring mysteries out of pure devotion to knowledge. Eliza fit this profile perfectly. She had chosen that isolated location in the Appalachians precisely because it offered the ideal conditions for her studies: isolation, energetically favorable terrain, and proximity to natural water sources with specific mineral characteristics. On one of their afternoons working together, Jonathan and Blackwell found a notebook hidden under a loose floorboard in Eliza's room. This notebook contained entries from the last months of 1908, a period not documented in the main diary. The notes revealed that Eliza had intensified her preparations as the winter solstice approached. She described sensations of being watched, not by physical people, but by presences she could only detect in states of deep meditation. Eliza wrote about establishing communication with something that existed beyond ordinary perception. Her descriptions were abstract, using metaphors related to vibrations, frequencies, and resonances. She mentioned receiving instructions on how to proceed during the night of the solstice, when the celestial alignment would reach its peak. There was urgency in her words, as if she knew that this opportunity would not be repeated in her physical existence. The last entry in the notebook was dated December 21st, 1908, exactly on the day of the winter solstice. Eliza wrote briefly, noting that all preparations were complete. She described the basement as a transformed space, where she had concentrated the vegetal, mineral, and symbolic elements necessary for what she called the crossing. She did not explain the exact meaning of this term, but her writing conveyed a mixture of serenity and anticipation. The last words written simply said, "May this portal lead me to what I have sought throughout this journey." Blackwell and Jonathan exchanged glances laden with implication. They both understood that they were facing something that defied conventional explanation. Eliza had not been a victim of external circumstances. She had deliberately orchestrated an experiment that, according to her beliefs and studies, would lead her to some different place or state of existence. Whether this experiment had been successful, or whether something had gone wrong, remained impossible to determine. Jonathan suggested that perhaps it would be prudent to leave the house as it was, transforming it into a kind of preserved sanctuary. Blackwell, on the other hand, had legal responsibilities to consider. He couldn't simply close the case without at least trying to offer some conclusion to the county authorities. The two men debated at length about the best approach, aware that any decision made would have lasting implications. While Blackwell and Jonathan debated their next steps, other events began to occur in Webster Springs that further complicated the situation. Residents reported strange experiences when passing near Eliza's property. A shopkeeper mentioned seeing pale lights moving past the windows of the house during the early morning hours, even though she knew the place was officially unoccupied. A farmer swore he heard melodies coming from that direction, songs in languages he didn't recognize carried by the night wind. Blackwell initially attributed these accounts to the collective imagination, fueled by the stories circulating about Eliza, but when he himself decided to spend a night observing the property from afar, he noticed phenomena he couldn't rationally explain. The temperature around the house seemed different, a few degrees colder than expected for that time of year. There was a peculiar quality to the air, an atmospheric density that made each breath seem more labored. Jonathan showed no surprise upon hearing these accounts. He explained that places where people engaged in intense energy concentration practices often developed residual characteristics. It was as if Eliza's intentions and actions had permeated that space in a way that transcended the physical. He compared the phenomenon to how certain historical sites retain a distinct atmosphere, carrying echoes of past events that refuse to completely dissipate. Judge Hartley, upon being informed of these occurrences, suggested a pragmatic approach. He proposed that the house be temporarily sealed off, preventing public access while they decided how to proceed officially. Blackwell agreed, personally overseeing the sealing of all entrances, but even with locked doors and sealed windows, reports of unusual activity did not cease. If anything, they intensified. In May 1909, an unexpected twist brought a new perspective to the case. An elderly woman named Grace Thornton approached Blackwell, claiming to have relevant information about Eliza. Grace had lived in the mountains for over 40 years and knew virtually everyone in the area. She revealed that Eliza was not the first person to occupy that property for similar purposes. According to Grace, decades earlier, in the 1870s, a solitary man named Silas Crowther had lived in that same house. Silas was also known for unusual practices, although at the time people were even more discreet about matters considered unconventional. He cultivated rare plants, received visitors at night, and spent hours in his basement engaging in activities that no one fully understood. One winter night, Silas simply disappeared, leaving the house intact but empty. The story didn't end there. Grace mentioned that, researching old records kept by her family, she had discovered that even before Silas in the early 1800s, that land had been chosen by a group of people from Europe. They had built the original structure of the house, following precise geometric specifications, orienting it according to specific solar positions. That location hadn't been chosen randomly by any of its occupants. There was something in the topography, the mineral composition of the soil, or the confluence of groundwater that made it special. Jonathan absorbed this information with evident fascination. He explained that among the members of his circle, there was knowledge about places considered natural portals, points where the barriers between different dimensions of existence became more permeable. These locations were rare and often identified through generations of observation and experimentation. Eliza, in choosing that property, probably knew of its history and its unique properties. Blackwell began to see the case from a completely different perspective. He wasn't investigating an isolated incident, but rather a recent chapter in a sequence of events that spanned more than a century. Each person who had inhabited that house sought something similar, using knowledge passed down through discrete lineages of practitioners. Eliza was simply the latest in a succession of explorers of these mysterious frontiers. In June of that year, Jonathan announced that he would need to return to Massachusetts, but would leave Blackwell with permanent contact information. He wished to be informed immediately of any developments. Before leaving, he suggested that the house be preserved not as a crime scene, but as a repository of valuable knowledge. He proposed that members of the circle could eventually study the materials left by Eliza, learning from her experiences, and possibly continuing the work she had begun. Blackwell considered the proposal seriously. He recognized that he lacked the technical capacity to fully comprehend everything Eliza had left behind. At the same time, his responsibility as a law enforcement officer required him to offer some kind of formal conclusion. He decided to draft a report documenting the observable facts: Eliza's absence, the state of her property, the testimonies collected, and the materials found. He avoided speculation about her fate, limiting himself to declaring the case as one of absence under undetermined circumstances. Summer brought a temporary calm. Reports of unusual phenomena around the property decreased in frequency, though they did not cease entirely. The community of Webster Springs gradually returned its attention to everyday matters. Although the name of Eliza Warren remained a topic of occasional conversation on tavern nights, some turned her into a local legend, a mysterious figure who had defied conventions and disappeared under enigmatic circumstances. For Blackwell, however, the case remained present in his thoughts. He kept Eliza's notebooks in his office, revisiting them periodically in the hope of discovering some previously overlooked detail. There was a wisdom in those records that fascinated him, a way of seeing the world that challenged the rigid structures in which he had been raised. He began to question his own certainties about the nature of reality, recognizing that perhaps there were layers of human experience that conventional society simply ignored or ridiculed. Grace Thornton became a regular visitor to Blackwell's office, sharing further stories about the hidden history of that mountainous region. She spoke of water sources considered sacred by native peoples who inhabited those lands centuries before European colonization. She mentioned rock formations with peculiar acoustic properties, where sounds behaved in unexpected ways, and she described deep caves that no one dared to fully explore, fearing getting lost in the subterranean labyrinths that branched out beneath the Appalachian Mountains. The autumn of 1909 marked a significant shift in Blackwell's understanding of the entire affair. During one of his conversations with Grace Thornton, she mentioned a detail she had not previously shared. According to her, there was a set of symbols engraved on a rock formation about 3 kilometers from Eliza's property. These symbols had been discovered by hunters many years before, but no one had ever been able to interpret them or determine their origin. Blackwell decided to investigate personally. Accompanied by Grace, he hiked along steep trails until he reached a limestone outcrop partially hidden by dense vegetation. There, protected from the weather by the rock's natural protrusions, were carvings that were clearly not the work of natural erosion. They were complex geometric symbols, intertwined circles, spirals that expanded into mathematical patterns, and characters that resembled writing, but did not correspond to any alphabet that Blackwell recognized. Grace explained that these symbols predated the arrival of European colonists, possibly left by native cultures that inhabited those mountains in ancient times. But there was also evidence that later visitors had added their own markings, creating layers of meaning that overlapped across the centuries. Blackwell mentally photographed the symbols, recognizing similarities to some of the drawings found in Eliza's notebooks. This discovery reinforced the theory that Eliza did not work in isolation, but connected to a much older tradition. She had studied knowledge preserved through generations, adapting it to her own needs and understandings. That region of the Appalachians, was not only her place of residence, but a sacred space chosen for its intrinsic characteristics, recognized by different groups throughout history. In October, Blackwell received a letter from Jonathan Pierce. The academic informed him that he had shared the developments in the case with other members of the circle, and 3 of them had expressed interest in visiting Webster Springs to personally examine Eliza's property. Jonathan requested formal permission for these scholars to access the house and conduct their own investigations, promising full cooperation with local authorities and a commitment to preserving everything as found. Blackwell consulted Judge Hartley about the request. After deliberation, they decided to allow the visit under strict supervision. In November of that year, 3 visitors arrived at Webster Springs. They were ordinary-looking people, with nothing to distinguish them outwardly, but their conversations revealed impressive intellectual depth. They introduced themselves as Margaret, an elderly botany scholar from Baltimore, Samuel, versed in astronomy and sacred geometry, residing in Charleston, and Thomas, a specialist in oral traditions and forgotten languages, who had traveled from Savannah. For a week, this trio meticulously explored every inch of Eliza's property. They examined the garden plants, identifying species that Blackwell didn't even know existed. They studied the markings in the basement, making precise measurements and extensive notes. They analyzed the notebooks, translating passages that had previously remained incomprehensible, and they visited the surrounding locations mentioned by Grace, establishing connections between the house and the natural energy points of the region. Margaret revealed that many of the plants cultivated by Eliza were considered lost to modern botany. Some had been described in medieval European herbaria, but were supposedly extinct for centuries. Others appeared to be varieties developed through selective breeding techniques that took generations to perfect. Eliza's garden was, therefore, not only a functional space, but a living archive of botanical knowledge accumulated over the ages. Samuel focused on the architectural and geometric aspects of the property. He discovered that the house's orientation corresponded precisely to specific astronomical alignments. The windows were positioned so that, on certain dates of the year, sunlight would fall on exact points inside. The basement had been built respecting geometric proportions that appeared in sacred structures of various ancient cultures. Nothing in the construction was random. Each element served meticulously calculated purposes. Thomas devoted himself to Eliza's writings, especially those in obscure codes or languages. He managed to identify fragments of ancient Celtic languages, references to Gnostic traditions, and elements of knowledge systems preserved by Hermetic groups throughout European history. Eliza had synthesized information from multiple sources, creating her own hybrid system that combined ancestral wisdom with modern empirical observation. At the end of the week, the 3 visitors met with Blackwell and Hartley to share their conclusions. They explained that Eliza had reached a level of understanding rarely attained, even among the most dedicated practitioners of their disciplines. The work she had done in that house represented decades of preparation and study. The winter solstice event of 1908 had not been an impulsive act, but the culmination of a carefully crafted plan. Margaret suggested that Eliza might have induced in herself such a profound altered state of consciousness that her ordinary perceptions were completely transformed. Samuel proposed that she may have been trying to synchronize her own life energy with larger cosmic patterns, seeking a form of physical transcendence. Thomas believed she was seeking to access dimensions of knowledge that exist beyond ordinary sensory perception, using her body as an instrument of exploration. None of them claimed to know for sure what had happened. They recognized the limits of their own understanding. But they all agreed on one point: Eliza Warren had not been a victim of tragic circumstances. She had been the active protagonist of her own narrative, pursuing goals that had supreme meaning for her. Her absence was not a mystery to be solved through conventional investigative methods, but rather a question that touched upon the limits of what human reason can comprehend about existence and consciousness. Blackwell absorbed these perspectives with an open mind. His worldview had been profoundly challenged throughout that year. He had begun the investigation expecting to find straightforward answers, perhaps evidence of a crime or clues to a planned escape. Instead, he had encountered layers of complexity that deepened endlessly, raising philosophical questions about the nature of reality and the limits of human experience. The 3 visitors left Webster Springs carrying authorized copies of some of Eliza's documents, promising to study them and eventually share their findings with a wider circle of scholars. They also left detailed instructions on how to properly preserve the organic and chemical materials found on the property, ensuring that future generations could continue learning from Eliza's legacy. Winter returned to Appalachia, bringing with it memories of the previous year when Eliza had conducted her last documented experiment. Blackwell often found himself gazing at the empty property, watching the snow blanket the roof and transform the garden into a uniform white mantle. There was something poetic about this repeating cycle, as if nature itself were paying silent homage to the one who had dedicated her life to understanding its deepest mysteries. During the cold months, Blackwell dedicated himself to meticulously organizing all the materials collected throughout the investigation. He created a comprehensive archive containing photographs of the symbols found in the rock formations, transcripts from Eliza's notebooks, copies of correspondence exchanged with members of the circle, and detailed reports of the scholars' visits. His goal was no longer to solve a criminal case, but rather to properly document a phenomenon that transcended conventional categories of legal classification. Grace Thornton became an essential collaborator in this documentation process. She possessed an extraordinary memory of events that had occurred in that region over decades, and her narratives added valuable historical context to recent discoveries. During long afternoons in Blackwell's office, she shared stories about other eccentric individuals who had inhabited those mountains, each leaving their peculiar mark on the cultural tapestry of the community. Grace spoke of a musician who had lived there in the 1880s, a man who played instruments made from natural materials collected in the forests. His melodies, according to witnesses of the time, had unusual properties. People reported entering states of profound tranquility upon listening to them, experiencing colorful visions even with their eyes closed. The musician never revealed the source of his knowledge, but he kept notebooks filled with musical notations that did not follow conventional systems of composition. There was also a painter who had briefly settled in the region during the 1890s. She created canvases that captured local landscapes, but her depictions included elements that observers could not see with the naked eye. Colors that did not exist in the common visible spectrum, geometric shapes that floated among the trees, entities that seemed to inhabit the spaces between light and shadow. Many considered her works the product of a feverish imagination, but some swore they recognized in them authentic aspects of reality that only keen sensibilities could perceive. These stories revealed a consistent pattern. That region of the Appalachians attracted or produced individuals who operated on the fringes of social consensus about reality. They were not madmen or charlatans, but sincere explorers of dimensions of human experience often neglected by pragmatic society. Eliza fit perfectly into this tradition, perhaps representing its most refined and intentional expression. In February 1910, Blackwell received correspondence from Adelaide, the Salem woman mentioned in the letters found at Eliza's house. Adelaide wrote carefully, demonstrating an awareness that her letter might be read by authorities. She expressed gratitude for the documentation work Blackwell was doing, acknowledging the rarity of finding a law enforcement representative willing to address such sensitive matters with an open mind and respect. Adelaide shared that the circle of scholars to which she belonged was organizing a compilation of knowledge preserved by its members. It would be an extensive work, bringing together practices, observations, and theories developed over generations. She requested permission to include references to Eliza's work, naturally omitting details that could specifically identify her or compromise her posthumous privacy. Blackwell readily agreed, recognizing that preserving that knowledge had value that transcended bureaucratic considerations. The following months brought a gradual return to normalcy to life in Webster Springs. Eliza's property remained sealed but preserved, becoming a local landmark about which people spoke with a mixture of respect and unease. Occasionally, travelers interested in esoteric matters arrived in the village, seeking information about her, drawn by rumors that circulated discreetly among communities of practitioners throughout the country. Blackwell developed a protocol for dealing with these visitors. She received them cordially, but shared only basic information, protecting both Eliza's privacy and the integrity of the investigation. Some demonstrated impressive knowledge of the practices in which she was involved, confirming through their questions and comments that her work had significant relevance for those who dedicated their lives to similar studies. One of these visitors, an elderly man from Missouri, who identified himself only as Nathaniel, brought a particularly interesting perspective. He explained that there were several locations scattered throughout the United States considered natural portals. These places possessed specific geological and energetic characteristics that made them ideal for certain practices. Mountains, due to their altitude and mineral composition, often served as amplifiers of directed human intentions. Nathaniel described how experienced practitioners developed a sensitivity to identify these locations. It wasn't a matter of conventional geographical mapping, but rather of attunement to environmental subtleties that most people simply didn't perceive. Eliza, according to him, possessed this sensitivity to an exceptional degree. She had likely traveled extensive distances before finding that specific spot in the Appalachians, instantly recognizing its unique qualities. During the conversation, Nathaniel mentioned something that made Blackwell reconsider entire aspects of the investigation. He suggested that the periodic absences documented in the history of that property were not tragic coincidences, but rather successes. Each person who had inhabited that place and eventually disappeared could have achieved the goal they sought. Physical absence would not necessarily mean death or tragedy, but rather a transition to alternative states of existence. This perspective profoundly challenged Blackwell's fundamental assumptions. He had always operated within a paradigm that viewed death as the ultimate end and absence as a problem to be solved. Nathaniel proposed a vision in which human consciousness could exist in forms not limited by physical corporeality, and that sufficiently prepared individuals could deliberately move between different modes of being. Blackwell questioned Nathaniel about evidence for such claims. The visitor responded with analogies. He explained that just as people blind from birth cannot fully comprehend descriptions of color until they eventually gain sight, individuals who have never experienced altered states of consciousness cannot adequately evaluate accounts from those who have. Direct experience was the only path to genuine understanding, and that experience required preparation, discipline, and courage. Before leaving, Nathaniel entrusted Blackwell with a small leather-bound volume. It was a collection of texts on perennial philosophies found in different cultural traditions throughout history. Hindus, Buddhists, Sufis, Christian mystics, European hermeticists, American shamanic traditions, all shared similar conceptions about the multidimensional nature of reality and the human capacity to transcend ordinary limitations through dedicated practices. Blackwell spent weeks absorbing that material. Each page opened new horizons of thought, challenging certainties he had carried throughout his life. He began to question not only Eliza's case, but the very nature of his existence and purpose. Why was he here? What constituted a life well lived? Were there really boundaries beyond those imposed by ordinary sensory perception? These reflections subtly transformed his approach to daily work. He became more contemplative, less quick to judge situations based solely on superficial appearances. He developed greater patience with witnesses who reported unusual experiences, recognizing that reality could be far more complex than his formal training had prepared him to accept. Grace observed these changes with quiet approval. In one of their conversations, she remarked that perhaps the true purpose of Eliza's case wasn't to be solved in the conventional sense, but rather to serve as a catalyst for transformation for those who approached it with sincerity. Blackwell smiled at this, recognizing the wisdom contained in the observation. He had truly been transformed by that investigation in ways he had never anticipated. The spring of 1910 brought renewal not only to the Appalachian landscape, but also to the investigation Blackwell was conducting. In March of that year, he made a decision that would fundamentally change his relationship with the case. He decided to spend an entire night on Eliza's property, not as an investigator seeking evidence, but as an observer, willing to experience that space in the way she likely had experienced it. He prepared himself carefully for this experience. He took with him only a lantern, water, and Eliza's notebooks, which he had studied exhaustively. He arrived at the house at twilight when the shadows of the mountains began to swallow the valleys and the first nocturnal sounds of the forest awakened. The dark wooden structure received him in silence, its windows reflecting the last rays of sunlight like half-open eyes. Blackwell settled into the main room, sitting precisely where he imagined Eliza usually meditated. He could feel the density of the air around him, that peculiar quality so many people had mentioned. As the hours passed, his senses began to adjust to the environment. Small sounds that initially seemed random revealed rhythmic patterns. The temperature fluctuated in subtle but perceptible ways. And there was an indefinable sense of presence, not threatening but undeniably real. During that night, Blackwell did not witness any dramatic supernatural phenomena. There were no spectral apparitions or inexplicable physical manifestations, but he experienced something equally significant, a gradual transformation of his own consciousness. As he remained still, breathing calmly and keeping his mind open, perceptions that normally lay in the background became vividly present. He could feel the subtle vibration of the earth beneath his feet, a constant pulse that seemed to emanate from the geological depths. He heard layers of sounds that he usually filtered unconsciously, the movement of small animals on the walls, the imperceptible settling of the wooden structure, the flow of air through microscopic cracks. And at some point during the hours before dawn, he experienced a sensation of expansion, as if the boundaries of his individual identity became porous and permeable. When the sun rose, Blackwell emerged from the house transformed. He couldn't precisely articulate what he had experienced, but he knew for sure that his understanding of reality had been permanently altered. He understood now, not intellectually but viscerally, why Eliza had dedicated her life to those studies. There were layers of experience accessible to human consciousness that vastly transcended what conventional culture recognized as real. In the following days, he shared this experience with Grace Thornton. She listened attentively, nodding occasionally as if recognizing something familiar. When he finished, Grace revealed that she herself had spent nights in that place decades before, when Silas Crowther still lived there. Their experiences had been similar, that feeling of dissolving boundaries between self and environment, the heightened perception of subtle dimensions of reality. Grace explained that these altered states of consciousness were not abnormal or pathological, but rather latent abilities that every person possessed. Modern life, with its constant demands for fragmented attention, tended to atrophy these abilities. But in conducive environments and with the right disposition, anyone could rediscover them. Eliza had simply dedicated her life to systematically cultivating these skills, taking them to levels that few achieved. In April, Blackwell received a visit from Solomon, the man from New Orleans, whose letter had been found among Eliza's mail. Solomon arrived unannounced, presenting himself directly at the sheriff's office with a demeanor that was both respectful and confident. He explained that the Circle of Scholars was organizing a commemorative gathering in honor of Eliza, and they wished Blackwell to participate. Initially hesitant, Blackwell eventually agreed. The gathering would take place in June at a secluded property in the Tennessee mountains, a location that served as a meeting point for Circle members from different regions. Solomon assured him that there would be nothing sinister or illegal, just people coming together to share knowledge, honor the memory of a dedicated practitioner, and celebrate traditions they preserved. When June arrived, Blackwell embarked on the journey to Tennessee. The property chosen for the gathering was located in a remote valley, accessible only by narrow trails that snaked between imposing rock formations. Upon arriving, he found approximately 20 people already gathered. They were men and women of varying ages, ordinary appearances, but all sharing an intangible quality of depth and presence. For 3 days, Blackwell participated in fascinating discussions. Those present shared their own experiences, with practices similar to Eliza's. They spoke of meditation techniques passed down through generations, methods of working with plants that enhanced altered states of consciousness, and astronomical observations that revealed cosmic patterns influencing terrestrial rhythms. There was no formal hierarchy among them, only mutual respect based on experience and dedication. Jonathan Pierce was present, as were Margaret, Samuel, and Thomas, the scholars who had visited Webster Springs. There were also practitioners whom Blackwell did not know, each bringing unique perspectives. A woman from Arizona shared knowledge about intuitive navigation through deserts, following invisible energy currents. A man from Maine described his research on the acoustic properties of certain coastal rock formations, where ocean waves created sound frequencies capable of inducing deep meditative states. Adelaide, the Salem correspondent, led a memorial service for Eliza. It wasn't religious in the conventional sense, but rather a collective acknowledgement of the legacy she had left behind. Each person briefly shared how Eliza's work had influenced their own paths. They spoke of her with reverence, but also with joy, celebrating not a loss, but a successful transition to something they all aspired to understand. During the ceremony, Solomon read selected excerpts from Eliza's notebooks. Her words, written years before in mountain solitude, resonated within that circle of attentive listeners. She described the human search for meaning, the courage needed to question social consensus, and the beauty of dedicating oneself completely to exploring the deepest mysteries of existence. There was no fear in her writing, only serene determination and insatiable curiosity. Blackwell was deeply moved by that collective experience. For the first time since the beginning of his research, he didn't feel isolated in his anxieties. He was among people who shared his questions, who validated his experiences, and who offered a broader context for understanding the extraordinary case he had become involved in. Eliza was not alone on her journey. She was part of a vast and ancient tradition that would continue to exist far beyond any individual. On the final night of the gathering, the group met around a campfire under a magnificently clear, starry sky. Conversations flowed naturally, alternating between mundane topics and profound reflections. Someone played a wooden flute, simple melodies that harmonized perfectly with the sounds of the night forest. Blackwell watched the dancing flames, feeling connected not only to those present, but to a lineage that stretched across centuries, thousands of seekers who dedicated their lives to transcending the ordinary limitations of human experience. Upon returning to Webster Springs after the meeting in Tennessee, Blackwell carried with him a completely renewed perspective. The trip had been more than a simple geographical displacement. It represented a journey between ways of understanding existence, a passage from a paradigm limited by social conventions to another that embraced infinitely vaster possibilities. He was no longer just a sheriff investigating a mysterious absence. He had become, in a way, the guardian of a legacy that transcended any legal or administrative category. The summer months passed with a different quality. Blackwell maintained his professional responsibilities, but dedicated every free moment to studying the materials left by Eliza with renewed depth. He no longer sought solutions in the conventional sense, but rather a genuine understanding of the principles that guided his work. Each symbol in his notebooks revealed layers of meaning that had previously remained hidden. Each note on medicinal plants concealed sophisticated pharmacological knowledge developed through careful experimentation. Grace Thornton became her mentor in this learning process. She possessed practical knowledge of the Appalachian Mountains that perfectly complemented Eliza's theoretical studies. Together, they began mapping the energetically significant locations in the region. They identified water sources with unique mineral properties, rock formations that amplified sounds in peculiar ways, and clearings where vegetation grew, following natural geometric patterns that suggested deep subterranean influences. During one of these exploratory expeditions in July, Grace took Blackwell to a cave that few knew about. The entrance was discreet, partially hidden by dense bushes and accessible only via a steep descent between loose rocks. Once inside, however, the cave opened into a wide chamber with a high ceiling supported by stalactite formations that resembled the columns of a natural temple. The acoustics of the space were extraordinary. A whisper produced in a corner echoed in an amplified and prolonged way, creating otherworldly harmonies. Grace explained that the place was known to native peoples who inhabited the region centuries before. They used it for ceremonies involving chanting and percussion, taking advantage of the natural acoustic properties to induce altered states of consciousness. With the arrival of European colonizers, knowledge about this place was lost, preserved only through oral traditions maintained by families like hers who had lived in the mountains for generations. Blackwell remained in that cave for hours, experiencing its unique atmosphere. He could feel why places like that were considered sacred. There was a quality in the air, a density that seemed to carry memories of all who had been there before. He imagined Eliza visiting this space, perhaps conducting her own explorations, connecting with ancestral traditions through the direct experience of the natural environment. In August, Blackwell received correspondence from Adelaide, informing him that the compilation of knowledge mentioned earlier was progressing well. Several members of the circle had contributed manuscripts detailing their areas of expertise. The resulting volume would be a substantial work, potentially reaching hundreds of pages. Adelaide inquired whether Blackwell would consider writing a chapter on Eliza's case, offering his unique perspective as an investigator who had transitioned from skepticism to understanding. The proposal intrigued Blackwell deeply. He had never considered himself a writer, but he recognized that he had a unique story to tell. It was rare for someone in his position, a representative of established law, to so fully embrace a worldview that challenged dominant cultural orthodoxies. His narrative could serve as a bridge between conventional and alternative perspectives, making complex ideas more accessible to those still trapped in limiting paradigms. During September, Blackwell dedicated himself to the task of writing. He discovered that the process of transforming experiences into words deepened his own understanding. He needed to articulate not only external events, but also internal changes he had experienced. How to describe that night spent at Eliza's house, when ordinary perceptions dissolved into something vaster. How to communicate the feeling of connection experienced during the encounter in Tennessee, when boundaries between individualities seemed artificial and arbitrary. The text he produced throughout that month surprised him with its very honesty. He wrote about his initial doubts, his unexamined prejudices, and the psychological resistance he had to overcome to embrace new possibilities. He described Eliza not as a mysterious and distant figure, but as a dedicated human being who followed her convictions to their ultimate consequences. And he reflected on what it meant to live authentically, pursuing personal truths even when they contradicted social expectations. She sent the manuscript to Adelaide in early October. Weeks later, she received an enthusiastic reply. She praised the clarity of her writing and the courage of her vulnerability. Other members of the circle who had read the text shared similar sentiments. Some commented that her chapter might be the most important piece of the compilation, precisely because it came from someone initially outside those traditions. Her journey of transformation exemplified possibilities open to anyone willing to question self-imposed limitations. In November 1910, approximately 2 years after Eliza's passing, Blackwell made another significant decision. With the approval of Judge Hartley and the agreement of the Circle of Scholars, he established a formal arrangement for the preservation of Eliza's property. The house would be maintained as it was, effectively transformed into a living archive of esoteric knowledge. Authorized members of the circle could visit it periodically for study, but always under supervision and with a commitment to preserving its integrity. Grace Thornton agreed to serve as the local caretaker of the property. Her advanced age did not diminish her ability to walk the mountain trails, and her deep knowledge of the region ensured that she could adequately protect that special space. Blackwell provided modest funds for basic maintenance, ensuring that the roof remained waterproof and that the windows continued to be sealed against the elements. During the following winter, Blackwell reflected extensively on the nature of the investigation he had conducted. Conventional police cases sought definitive answers, culprits identified, crimes solved, mysteries explained through linear causal chains. Eliza's case completely defied this model. There was no crime, no culprits, and the mystery deepened the more it was explored. But this did not signify investigative failure. It represented, in fact, a different kind of success, expanded understanding rather than a closed conclusion. He began to question how many other cases throughout his career could have benefited from a similar approach. How many situations classified as inexplicable actually contained alternative logics that remained invisible to observers trapped in narrow paradigms. Perhaps the true function of an investigator was not always to close cases, but occasionally to open them, in ways that revealed previously unconsidered possibilities. In January 1911, Jonathan Pierce visited Webster Springs again. He brought news that the compilation of knowledge was nearing completion. The volume would be published in a limited way, distributed only among members of the circle, and selected institutions that demonstrated a genuine interest in preserving marginalized traditions. They were not seeking publicity or mainstream recognition, but rather to ensure that this knowledge would not be lost over generations. Jonathan also shared that there was growing interest among younger members of the circle in establishing permanent study locations. Eliza's property in the Appalachians could serve as a model for other similar spaces in different regions of the country, places where dedicated practitioners could conduct research away from modern distractions, connecting deeply with natural environments while exploring the frontiers of human consciousness. Blackwell enthusiastically supported this vision. He recognized that Eliza's legacy should not merely be preserved statically, but rather serve as a living inspiration for future generations. Her mountain home could become a pilgrimage site for those seeking to understand the paths she had walked, not to slavishly imitate her, but to find their own versions of similar journeys. During the spring of 1911, Blackwell began receiving visitors with increasing frequency. People who had heard about the case through the discreet networks of the circle traveled to Webster Springs seeking information. He developed a refined skill in assessing the sincerity of these visitors, distinguishing genuine, curious individuals from sensationalists seeking only morbid entertainment. To the sincere, he offered supervised access to the property and generously shared his accumulated knowledge. One of these visitors, a young woman named Catherine from Pennsylvania, showed particularly deep interest. She was beginning her own journey of exploration, seeking mentors who could guide her. Blackwell recognized in her the same intensity he imagined had characterized Eliza in her youth. He devoted considerable time to conversing with Catherine, answering her questions and offering perspectives based on his own recent transformations. Catherine stayed in Webster Springs for 2 weeks, absorbing everything she could learn. She visited Eliza's property multiple times, always with appropriate reverence. She explored the significant natural sites under Grace's guidance, and she spent long hours in Blackwell's office, studying copies of notebooks and correspondence. Before leaving, she expressed profound gratitude, stating that the experience had clarified her own path in ways she had not anticipated. Watching Catherine leave left Blackwell with bittersweet feelings. On the one hand, he was glad to have contributed to someone else's journey. On the other, he recognized that his own role was changing. He had inadvertently become a sort of gatekeeper, someone who facilitated access to preserved knowledge while protecting its integrity. It was a responsibility he hadn't sought, but one he embraced with increasing seriousness. The following years brought Blackwell a serene acceptance of the nature of the case that had transformed his life. He finally understood that some stories are not destined for definitive conclusions. They exist to remind us that reality is far vaster than our minds can grasp through limited categories. Eliza Warren had chosen a unique path. Driven by searches that transcended conventional explanations, the mountain property remained a silent testament to that extraordinary journey. Occasional visitors continued to arrive, drawn by something indefinable that emanated from that place. Each carried away fragments of inspiration, seeds of questioning that could germinate in their own lives. Grace maintained her dedicated vigil, aging gracefully as she shared stories of the mountains with anyone who showed receptive ears. Blackwell began to see his work in a completely different light. Each case that landed on his desk was no longer just an administrative problem to be processed, but an opportunity to find the human being behind the circumstances. Some situations proved simple, others complex, and a few touched on those mysterious boundaries where certainties dissolve and questions flourish. The seasons continued their eternal cycle across the Appalachians. Springs brought renewal to the forests, summers warmed the valleys with golden light, autumns painted the slopes with impossible hues, and winters covered everything with white blankets of silence. Eliza's house remained there, a solitary structure among ancient trees, guarding secrets that perhaps would never be fully understood, but which would continue to inspire those brave enough to approach with reverence. We will never know for sure what happened on that solstice night in 1908. Eliza may have achieved what she sought, or she may have lost herself trying, but perhaps that uncertainty is precisely the point. Some journeys are not about destinations, but about the courage to set out in search of something greater than ourselves, something that challenges everything we have been taught to accept as real and possible. The story of Eliza Warren echoes through time not as a tragedy, but as an invitation to question, to explore, to recognize that the limits of our experience are often walls we ourselves have built. The Appalachian Mountains hold many secrets, and this is just one among countless others that still await those willing to listen to what the silence whispers. Blackwell lived out the rest of his years with a tranquility that came from having touched, even if briefly, something beyond the ordinary. He learned that investigating true mysteries doesn't always mean solving them, but rather allowing them to transform us. And perhaps that is the most profound lesson any story can offer. If you've made it this far on this journey with us, consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a comment sharing your thoughts on this story. Each perspective adds a new layer of understanding to